Ladies and gentlemen, Minecraft Java Edition 1.14 has released, and there's a huge amount of new things in it. I've already released almost 2 hours worth of videos covering these changes, but there's one thing missing, and that's all the tech changes. That is commands and data pack stuff. For all of you who are into making data packs or custom maps or just modifying the game in various ways. Those changes are all going to be covered in this video, and there are quite a lot of those as well, so as per usual I've split them into several sections. And as usual you can find timestamps to all of those sections down in the pinned comment if you want to skip to a certain section. We're gonna start with commands, changes to them and new commands, and NBT paths. And then we're gonna talk about changes to NBT. After that we're gonna talk about changes to text components and raw text. Then we're going to talk about a whole bunch of added things, new tags, new entities, new effects, new particles, new recipe types. And then after that we're going to go through a bunch of changes to packs, starting with resource packs and the changes to textures in them. And then we're going to move on to advancements, and then finally loot tables, starting off with all of the added loot tables and then a bunch of changes to the loot table format. There's quite a lot of added functionality to loot tables in this version. And then finally I'm quickly going to go through Jigsaw blocks. But let's get into it, shall we? Starting with commands. The data command now has a new option. It's data modify. You follow that up with the block or entity as per usual, and then a path and an operation. There are 2 operations for any value, those are set and merge, and then there are 3 operations for lists: append, prepend, and insert. This means that you can set a value, merge in a value, or append, prepend, or insert a value into a list. This in and of itself isn't all that useful, but the useful part comes now. What follows is the source, which can be value and then a literal NBT value, but it can also be block or entity with a path, and that will allow you to copy NBT values around from one block or entity into another block or entity. Very powerful once you get your head around this one. The execute command has a new specifier: execute if or unless data. Use that with a block or entity, so execute if data block with a position and a path, or execute if data entity with a selector and a path. This will execute the change command if or unless one or more matching data fields are found. And if you use it without a change command, it will return the number of matching data fields. Another change is that the time inputs can now have units. You can put T for ticks, that's the default, S for seconds, that's real seconds, or D for in-game days. And you can also use fractions as long as the resulting time measured in ticks is a whole number. This means, for instance, that you can use /time add 0.5D to add half an in-game day to the time. Another command that uses this is a new command called schedule. That is, schedule with a function name and then a time. And what this does is run the function that amount of time later. One caveat to this is that only one scheduled instance can exist per function, which means that if you rerun the schedule command for the same function name before the previous scheduling has run, then you will reschedule the function and remove the old scheduling. Another new command is the loot command. It runs a loot table and does something specified with the resulting items. The syntax for this is /loot with a target and then a source. This target specifies where the items go. That can be give and then a selector, which gives the items to the target as if you had run /give with those items. Insert and then a position, which inserts the items into a container block as if you'd shift-clicked them in there. It can also be spawn and then a position, which drops the items into the world as item entities. Or it can be replace, which works similar to the replace item command, but with the source items from the loot table instead. Of course, the loot table can also return more than one item, in which case /loot replace can replace more than one slot. The syntax for this is /loot replace block and then a position and the name of the first slot and optionally a count. Or /loot replace entity with a selector, a first slot and then optionally a count. If you give a count, then it will fill that many slots and then clear any remaining slots up to the number if there aren't enough drops from the loot table. If you don't specify a count, then as many slots as is needed are used. The source parameter to the loot command will determine which loot table gets run and what context to use for that loot table. It has 4 options. They are fish, kill, loot, or mine. The syntax for the fish source is fish, and then a loot table, position, and then optionally an item or main hand or offhand. This runs the loot table that you specified as if it was the result of fishing at the position that you gave, and if you gave an item, then as if that item was used for fishing. If you don't specify item, main hand or offhand, then the loot table is run as if you were fishing without any item. Source can also be kill with a selector, and that runs the loot table for killing that entity as if that target had been killed by the entity currently executing the command. Source can also be loot, and that is followed by a loot table, which runs a loot table as if it was spawning into a loot chest. And finally, it can be mine, followed by a position, and again optionally an item, main hand or offhand. And that gets loot from a loot table specified by the block at that position, as if it was mined with the item, or the main hand, or the offhand, or nothing if you didn't specify it. This is because block drops are specified by loot tables in this version. We'll get more in depth with that later when we talk about loot tables. Some fixes and changes for commands as well. The replace item command can now modify item frames. The query mode of the force load command can now be run from a command block or function. And a bug fix to /clear means it no longer produces ghost items if the player holds an item under their mouse cursor when the command is run. There are also a couple of command changes directed more towards players than to map makers, but we'll include them here for completeness. The /locate command now supports pillager_outpost as an option, locating one of the new pillager outposts of course. And there's a new command called team message, team MSG, or aliased to TM. That sends a message to everybody on the same team as the entity executing the command. And the one thing that might be interesting for map makers in this is that it works with any entity. So if you put an entity onto the same team as players, that entity can use the team message command to send messages to the team just as any player on the team could. NBT paths have changed. The NBT paths are used in a number of places, for instance with the data get command. Paths can now return multiple values. This is most simply illustrated by the fact that if you access a list without an index, then you will now select all of the elements of that list. You can also select the list entries by object contents, which means that you can basically search in lists. You do that by including key equals value in your list specifier. So for instance, you can select all the slots in an inventory that contain a certain item by matching the ID value of that item. One final change to NBT paths is also a list related one. You can now index into a list from the end of the list by using negative values. Let's get into changes to NBT. Now let's start with a change not to NBT itself, but to how the command parser accepts NBT values. When reading NBT values, the command parser now accepts single quoted strings as an option. This means that you can mix single and double quotes, especially for strings containing other strings, such as the case when you write NBT data containing raw texts. In this case, the most reliable way to use these is to write the outermost quote as a single quote and all of the internal quotes as normal double quotes. Of course, with all of the changes, there are also a number of changes to the actual NBT structure of various entities. Villager data, for instance, has changed dramatically. It now has a villager data field, and that contains type and profession strings, for instance. For more general changes, there's a block state tag value that you can now set on block items, and that contains block states, and those block states are applied when you place that block. There's also now a new custom model data value on items, and you can use that together with a resource pack with a new model predicate called custom_model_data in order to change the texture or model of an item without having to abuse the damage value. And that means that you can now have an enormous number of custom models, and those custom items can also have durability. Another change that might affect many mapmakers is that armor stands with the marker tag set now imply no gravity, so if you have a marker set, then your armor stand no longer has gravity. There are a couple of values added to the level data NBT. They are Wandering Trader's spawn chance and a Wandering Trader's spawn delay. Another interesting NBT value to mention is the Wandering Trader's Wander Target tag. That contains a block position, and when set, it causes the Wandering Trader to pathfind to that location. So you can use this in order to get access to the game's pathfinding functionality. And finally, on items, the lure tag now uses chat component syntax that is the same as in telraw and other raw JSON text. And that naturally segues us into the changes to text components. And that's simply one added new component, the NBT component. The syntax of this is NBT, and that has a path, and it also has a secondary field which is either block with a set of coordinates in a string, or entity with a selector in a string. It also can optionally have an interpret field, and if that's set to true, then the values of that NBT are in and of themselves interpreted as a text component. This basically works the same as selector components. If there are no elements, you will get an empty string, and if there are multiple elements, you will get a list of them merged with commas in between. Let's talk about tags. An entirely new type of tag has been added in this version. It's the entity tag. You can use this in command selectors by using type equals hash and then a tag name, and it can also be used from loot tables, for instance. There are two of these tags built into the game that can be overridden. They are Minecraft::Raiders, which contain all of the illager types as well as witches and ravagers, and Minecraft::Skeletons, containing skeletons, wither skeletons, and strays. There are a number of tags that have been added as both block and item tags. They are wooden_fences, contain all the wooden fence types, fences that contain all the wooden fence types and also nether brick fences, walls that contain all of the types of walls, small_flowers, and beds. As item tags, there's also a signs, a music_discs tag, and an arrows tag. For block tags, there are a bunch of unique new block tags as well. Dirt_like, containing dirt, grass, coarse dirt, podzol, and mycelium, and bamboo_plantable_on, which contains all of the dirt-like blocks in addition to gravel. There are also three different types of tags for signs: standing_signs, wall_signs, and signs that contain both of the previous ones. There are also two new ones related to boss mobs, dragon_immune and the wither_immune, controlling which types of blocks that the boss mobs cannot destroy. There are a bunch of new entity types in this version, and none of this should come as a surprise if you know about the changes to gameplay. They are Minecraft::pillager, ravager, wandering_trader, trader_llama, cat, panda, and fox. Two new mob effects in this version, Minecraft::bad_omen and Minecraft::hero of the village with underscores in between the words. There are four new recipe types in this version as well. They are Minecraft::stone cutting, Minecraft::campfire_cooking, Minecraft::smoking for the smoker, and Minecraft::blasting for the blast furnace. And note, for instance, that adding a recipe for smoking something does not imply that it is also smeltable. Three new particle types in this version. They are sneeze, campfire cozy smoke, and campfire signal smoke. In addition to this, the particle format has changed, been split up into individual textures, which means that if you have overrides in your resource pack, then you will have to split those up. As a side effect of this, particles can now have .mc meta files and be animated. Let's talk about other changes to resource pack making and textures and such. There are a number of more things that have been split up into individual textures. They are paintings that are now individual textures, but that also means that they can also be animated. And potion effects, the icons used for those in the user interface, are also now individual textures, which also means that they can now also be animated. Villager textures have changed completely, and not only just the textures, but there's an entirely new system for them. It is a layering system that will layer several textures on top of each other. That means that you first get a base villager texture, then a biome layer, a profession layer, and a level layer. So the base village texture contains all of the common element with all villagers, then the biome specific types, and then all of the profession details, and then the level texture, which is a full texture. In the vanilla game it's only used to change the little pouch or stone at the villager spout, but it is a full texture, so you could use it as such. There's also a possibility to have an MC meta file, and that describes how hats are treated. The hat imported from that layer can be none at all, in which case you don't even need the MC meta file, or the values partial or full, and that controls which type of hat can override which other type of hat. One final texture thing, the villager trading user interface has changed completely in this version, and that means that your previous overrides will no longer work. If you want to customize the villager trading interface, you will now have to customize the file villager2.png. Let's talk about advancements. There are a number of changes to that too. Entity type predicates now accept tags for entities. Those are written as hash and then the name of the tag. Damage source predicates now has a new option called is_lightning, and that should be fairly self-evident what that does. Entity predicates now accept a flags field. The available tests for that are is on fire, is sneaking, is sprinting, is swimming, and is baby, all of those written in lowercase with underscores. Entity predicates now also accept the equipment field, and that can contain up to 6 fields for head, chest, legs, feet, main hand, and offhand. And if any of those are set, then the test will fail for any entities that can't have equipment or that don't have the matching equipment. For our final section, we're going to talk about loot tables, and we're going to start by talking about all of the added loot tables. And a large part of the change to loot tables and the loot table format for this version are driven by the fact that block drops are now controlled by loot tables. You can find those in the loot table folder under blocks. There are also a whole bunch of other new loot tables for this version that aren't related to blocks. In the chests folder, there's a pillager_outpost loot table, as well as a village folder with a whole bunch of loot tables in it. One for every profession, simply called the name of the profession, so for instance mason, and one for each type of village, which is called the type of the village and then _house, so for instance desert_house. In the entities folder, there are of course a whole bunch of new loot tables for the added entities. Those are the loot tables for cat, fox, panda, pillager, ravager, trader, llama, and wandering trader. There are also a bunch of other added ones for armor stands, illusioners, players, and withers, with a note that most of these are just empty. The wither has a loot table in this version, but the drop of nether stars is not controlled through a loot table. In the gameplay folder, there is a cat morning gift loot table, as well as a hero of the village folder, and in that you'll find one loot table for every villager profession with the name of that profession followed by underscore and gift. So for instance mason_gift. One loot table has been removed in this version, that's the village_blacksmith one, and one has been renamed, that's mushroom cow, which is now called mushroom. And with that, let's get into the changes in the actual format of loot tables and all of the capabilities of the actual loot table files. Let's start with the type of loot tables. Loot tables can now have a type listed inside of the file. This is not mandatory, it's an optional field, but if you add it, you get some additional error checking. The available types are empty, chest, fishing, entity, advancement_reward, and block. What happens when you set this is that you will get warnings if you use a function that references data that isn't available in the context of that type. So for instance, if you use a function that references the killer player inside of a fishing loot table, you will get a warning. There are two changes that range across multiple different places in loot tables. One is that the flags field that we talked about in the advancement section is now also used in loot tables. So in some places where you have an entity predicate, you will now find a flags test for is on fire, is sneaking, is sprinting, is swimming, or is baby. Another change is that some functions and predicates like set name or fill player head and so on will now have an entity parameter. That can be this, which is usually the entity running the loot table, killer_player for the player towards whom the kill is counted, or killer, which is the primary source of the damage. So for instance, that would be the entity dealing the damage or the player holding the bow that shot the arrow or so. There's also an option to use direct_killer, which is the direct source of the damage. So for instance, if you were killing somebody with a bow and arrow, that would be the arrow projectile rather than the player holding the bow. There are a bunch of new loot table entry types in this version. There's dynamic, which is used to get block-specific drops. There's a name parameter to this with currently 2 implemented values. One is Minecraft:contents, which gets the block entity contents for shulker boxes, and Minecraft:self, which is useful for banners and player skulls. Another new entry type is alternatives. It has a list of child entries and it goes through them one at a time from the top down and executes the first one that can run. The next entry type is kind of the opposite, it's called sequence. It also has a list of child entries and it will execute them one at a time until it encounters one that can't run, at which point it will stop. The tag entry will get an item from an item tag instead of a specified item. It has an expand field, and if you set that to true, then you will basically get one copy of the entry for each item in the tag. And if you have it set to false, then it will make one item entry with the entire contents of the item tag in it. This, for instance, is used for the Creeper music disc drop, where the Creeper has a tag entry for the music_disc tag. And finally, there's a group entry, and that just simply executes the child entries whenever its own conditions pass, so it just groups a number of child entries. There are a whole bunch of new loot table functions as well. Copy_name, which copies the display name from a block entity to an item. There's copy_nbt, which copies nbt from a source to the item tags. Explosion_decay, which applies a flat chance for every item to be destroyed, and that item is equal to 1 divided by the explosion radius. There's a fill player head function that copies the player profile into a player head item, and that has one of the entity parameters that we mentioned before that can be either this, killer player, killer, or direct killer. But note that if the parameter doesn't resolve to an actual player, then you will not get a player head profile copied. There's a limit_count function, which just limits the count of every item stacks to a certain range. It has a limit parameter with 2 optional fields, min and max. There's a set_contents function that populates the items field of the block entity tag of the item with items from a list of entries. So this is an entries parameter, which in and of itself is a list of loot table entries. Basically what this means is that you can get a shulker box or chest or barrel or such item with a bunch of items inside of it from a loot table entry. There's also a function called setLootTable, which sets the loot table and loot pool seed tags of the block entity tag on the item. That has 2 parameters called name and seed, where seed is optional, and name is the ID of the loot table. This basically means that you can get a drop of a chest, which when placed will turn into a chest with a loot table. There's a set_lore function that adds or replaces lore lines. It has a lore parameter with a list of lines, and those lines are in chat component or draw.json format. There's a replace parameter, which is a boolean, and if that's true, then the previous lore on the item will be replaced. And an entity parameter, one of those new types of entities which references this killer player, killer, or direct killer. There's also an apply bonus function, which applies one of predefined enchantment bonus formulas, and that has 3 common fields. Those are enchantment with the ID of the enchantment level used for this calculation, formula, which is one of the types of bonus formula, and parameters with values for that formula. Depending on what formula value you choose, the parameters will be different. The 3 types of formulas are binomial with bonus count, uniform bonus count, and ordroffs. I won't be going through the details of those formulas here because I don't believe anybody would remember any of it. If you need to use apply bonus, go look these up. There's one modified function in this version. The set_name function now has an entity parameter which accepts this killer player, killer, or direct killer, so you can set the name based off of that value. There are a number of new loot table conditions as well, starting with alternative, and that has a parameter called terms, which is a list of conditions in and of itself, and the alternative condition matches if any of those terms matches. Block state property, which checks the properties of a block state for a block mining loot table, that has the parameters block, which is the ID of the block, and the properties, which is a map of property value pairs. Damage source properties, which checks the damage source. Inverted, which of course inverts a condition, and that condition is held in a parameter called term. Match_tool, which checks the tool of the context, and that's available for block breaking and fishing loot tables, and that has a predicate applied to the item which uses the same structure as advancements. location check, which applies an advancement location predicate. Then there's a survives explosion condition, which will return true with a probability of 1 divided by the explosion radius. Table bonus, which passes with a probability that is picked from a table indexed by the enchantment level, and that has parameters for the enchantment, which is the ID of the enchantment in question, and chances, which is a list of probabilities for enchantment levels, indexed from 0. And then finally there's a weather check condition, which obviously checks for the weather. It has 2 optional boolean fields for parameters called raining and thundering. And finally, for loot table formats, integer values can now specify which random number generator, or rather which random number distribution, to use for the randomization. The available types are constant, uniform, or binomial. If you don't specify this, the default value is uniform. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit more about an added block. It's the Jigsaw Block, and while it is a technical block, it's not truly a technical block that can be accessed yet. Of course, as a technical block, you can /give it to yourself, and it does exist in a number of the structure files in the game. But it's not really usable as such. There's no command to trigger it, and it has no active actions in the world, so you can't really trigger any actions off of it. At some point you will be able to use this to create jigsaw structures, and if you want a high-level rundown of how that system works, then please see my village generation video, which explains how the new villages are generated using this jigsaw system. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of the technical rundown of the changes in Minecraft Java Edition 1.14, the Village and Pillage update. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please help me out in return and leave a like, share it to your friends whenever somebody wonders about the changes to this version. And of course, if you want to stay up to date with the technical changes going forward, then please subscribe to my channel. There are tutorials there for tech stuff, as well as update videos for new snapshots whenever things change in the game. My name is slicedlime, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.